In this video, I want to return to the idea of zhan. And we're going to do that all the way through this series and keep coming back and keep giving new little puzzles to solve and keep interlinking it into our training. And I want to talk about a lot of things, but I want to begin with an exercise that's really very simple, and it begins to expand a little bit about something I was talking about in the previous video, the idea of a centerline, and that the centerline isn't real, it's something that's created, particularly through the use of centrifugal force. But we can think about that in a little bit more complex expansion now, and think about, well, it doesn't just get created through centrifugal force. I mean, it does, like physically, it gets created through centrifugal force, but to even do the movement in the first place, the mind has got to calculate at least a very close approximation of what it thinks is the centerline. So it's got to have an idea, literally a physical idea that it feels in the whole body where the centerline is in order to make the body move around it in the first place. So it's got to do these two things simultaneously. It's got to both create the centerline as like a product of the laws of physics, and it does that, by the way, through this natural version of the doctrine of the mean, this very important Chinese philosophical concept, trying to balance out the weight distribution of the body for centrifugal effect around this kind of imaginary centerline. And at exactly the same time, simultaneously, it's got to calculate that the centerline is there. It's got to assume that it is there, and it's got to make the calculations to make the body move centrifugally around it, because that's made to happen. It's not like just a wheel that's spinning. It's got to be made to happen in the first place. So you could equate it to the making the wheel spin in the first place. Something's got to do that. So the intent has got to do that. But also, like with a wheel, everything's fixed and you can see where the centerline is. That's not the same with a body. The intent has got to think about, well, there's going to be a centerline. Where is it? And how do I make the body move around it? And then when it does that, at the same time, it's got to make these calculations that crystallize everything into a real movement. And those calculations can be quite complex, because what we're doing very often is using a technique. So then we change the nature of the centerline. So for example, if we throw a long hook or something like that, even as we're throwing the hook out, we're changing the weight distribution around the body, and that's changing where the centerline is slightly. And of course that becomes more complex the more that you're throwing techniques, and the more you're moving around, then the more complex those calculations become. And that then feeds into the intention has got to measure that, like a kind of, the measures that you use when you're doing decorating or something like that, or you're building a level that's got like a little water bubble in it, and it's got to use that as a kind of measure. As it's actually creating the centerline through movement, then the feeling of the body as it moves around the centerline has got to become like a measure that the body uses, and that helps it then to feed out and calculate into things like footwork. Do I need to take a step out? How do I move? And that at the same time has also got to be responsive to an opponent, and also keep in mind tactics, and really quite a complicated set of calculations. So just this idea of simultaneously creating the centerline but also visualizing it. So it's not a particularly complex thing in and of itself. It's the sort of thing someone does when they first learn to ride a bike and you learn to balance. It's exactly that posture. But there's two really interesting things about it. Like one of the things that I've just talked about, that when you bring it into this really quite complex set of other calculations, then it does become a significantly more complex task. But also that from an Yiquan perspective, it's what Wang Qingjai's student Han Huang calls virtual reality. Like the centerline doesn't exist, and yet the intent has got kind of imagine that it does exist, and it's got to make calculations about where it is. It doesn't exist physically, it's created, but at the same time, even just from a resting posture, you want to start creating a sense of where that centerline is, that all the calculations can then be based on. As a physical reality, it's like a potential. If you're going to think like you're going to do a movement like this, a round movement, and all the weight distribution's got to be calculated and about how it will work in that kind of centrifugal posture. Well, if you think about that, if you just stood like this, then that's not there. That energy that creates the centreline isn't there. It's just potential. It's just potential. I mean, you might do something else instead. It's something that's going to happen in the future. If you're about to throw a punch, it's about to happen, you know, 0.5 of a second from now, and there it is. So it's not just there. It's not just there for the mind to calculate. You can calculate what roughly is your kind of centre of gravity from here, but it's got to make like a little bit of a future prediction about it. And that's a really sophisticated. It's a really sophisticated calculation. Obviously, our brains are super sophisticated, but it helps to open up a little door into this world that we're going to explore multiple times. The idea of virtual reality, or what zhan Yiquan calls virtual reality, the idea of visualization, the power and the role of visualization, and how that in many ways isn't just visualization. It's a much more complex thing. So that begins to tell us that example. That's not just like visualizing, for example, throwing a punch. This virtual concept that the E is having to calculate then becomes manifested in physical form. So that's an interesting concept. Well, let's think about an exercise, probably the simplest exercise, particularly in Tai Chi, but also in Yiquan. The idea of just imagining that there's a string or a rope holding your head up. And that's a really simple visualization that we can do like this. It's very often used, I think, just to indicate like head posture. People think, well, it just means head posture, and particularly in Tai Chi, that the idea of head posture, not letting the head come forward like that. But thinking about it like this, the idea then there's a rope and it's attached to the middle of the head. Well, that's exactly where your centreline is in a resting position. So just visualizing that. And for that visualization itself, what you want to imagine is not just that there's a rope holding your head, but you're being pulled up, or you're being pulled up by it. So you don't actually do it, like the intent does everything. And this is like one of the hardest things to work with in Yiquan, because there's a scale of things. Sometimes like you are using some muscular contraction, and sometimes you're just using your intent. And this is one where you just use your intent, and we assume that it must be having some effect on the actual musculature, but it's so liminal that it just feels like the effect is just happening in the mind. We know that kind of thing can happen because we know that later on, when we get very good at visualization, we get very used to the postures, we can just visualize them on their own and feel the effects in our mind, which is one of the really interesting things about visualization. But just imagining that the rope is pulling you up, and just really focusing on that. And then if you want to take that to another stage, and it's something hopefully I'll either talk about in this lesson or very shortly, there's an idea around assuming a particular kind of posture, and that posture feeling natural. So this kind of rounded apples under the arm posture. We'll talk about it more later, but we want to feel like that's our natural posture, that we're growing into this shape. And one of the ways to think about that is that you're being lifted off the ground like that in this shape, and you're holding this shape like it's your natural shape. Like the rope's going to lift you off the ground and you're going to hold this shape. That seems very abstract at the moment, but it'll make more sense later on. So have a practice at that posture. You can even kind of move a little bit and just have a think about where your axis really is. And you can even move, and we do lots of exercises like this, moving around we'll come to it another time. And moving and feeling where your axis is and moving around the axis and helping your body to generate this really interesting virtual reality concept, so that when you come to move, you've trained this idea that the E knows where roughly speaking, where that centre of gravity is going to be, and it can calculate when you start moving like that. It starts making these quite complex calculations about where it is, and that then feeds into decisions about routing and footwork and balance and the way that you use your structural symmetry and your sympathetic structure. Next, I want to expand a little bit about the meaning of zhan. I want to begin first of all by thinking about, unfortunately we have to do this, we have to think about the ideas that are already out there. And if each one's a scientific process, then we should be able to take other people's ideas and critique them in a scientific, this is what happens in the academic world. People put ideas forward and they're critiqued. And the first thing to say about this is something I've said before, that when you are thinking about how to assess what people are saying, you've got to look at the outcomes. You've got to look at where someone's ideas have led them. One of the reasons that this is very important is that people's explanations of Yiquan practices will almost always reflect what they've personally achieved. This is a direct consequence of something that Wang Shengjai tells us, that you can't understand what you can't do. There's other factors involved in it, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, but you can't understand what you can't do. So in many ways it's impossible. If you've not achieved certain things practically, then you're not going to have the correct explanations for them. That's not necessarily a problem for people who are really good. Wang Shengjai explains this idea. We'll come back to it in a moment because I think it applies very much to Wang Shengjai himself. I say quite controversially, but he says, like, if you're really, really good, then it doesn't really matter if you don't really understand how you're doing what you're doing. And if you've got like a kind of superstitious explanation, it doesn't matter because you're already really good. What it matters for is your students who aren't really good, who are trying to get like you, and they're trying to do it by following your explanation that isn't real. So they find that they actually can't get up to that same level. That might explain a lot of things around Wang Shengjai and the inability of people after him to achieve the same kind of level. Well, I mean, they say they couldn't achieve the same kind of level. We don't know how true that is and how far it's just like being respectful. But the issue today certainly is absolutely paramount, that people who have got explanations for things and they've overreached with the explanation. Now this happens in a very particular way, and it's a little bit like when you're writing an essay for college, say, and you don't know the answer to the question, so you write what you do know and then you change the question to fit the answer. And in this case, the question, well, let's say what the question's changed to, and we can kind of use our negative dialectics, ask ourselves what's wrong with this and work back from it. Inevitably, the question is changed to Yiquan is more than just fighting, discuss. That's the question that people fill in instead. That's not necessarily like an incorrect statement. So we can say that, yeah, of course, each one's about more than fighting. There's something kind of implicit in that statement in and of itself that's kind of derogatory. It's like, oh, you're a thug, you're only interested in fighting. And this goes against the direct teaching of Wang Shengjai, who says, ultimately, everything's got to be in the context of fighting. Everything's got to be about the nitty-gritty of fighting, even if it's about more than just fighting. At the end of the day, MMA is about more than just fighting. It's a platitude in that sense. MMA is about finding out about yourself, about keeping fit, about social contact. It's a living, it's a mode of achievement. It's something positive in people's lives that they can get up and go out and do. It's about more than fighting. But what it is at its core is fundamentally about fighting, and that's the context within which everything else grows. And that's the context which in MMA makes everything else valid. You're not really finding out about yourself unless you're doing like serious training. You're going to find out about yourself when you put the gloves on and do a few rounds. That's, if you like, a kind of spiritual, a real down-to-earth idea of spirituality. What usually is meant in Yiquan, when they come to write this essay, that they've changed the question of, there's a kind of narrative structure that they begin to use, and this question of each one is about more than fighting, discuss, gets changed again. So it gets changed into each one is about health, discuss. Each one is about spirituality, discuss. And the fighting element is taken away. It's erased. And this is happening because the people who are doing this, and I'm talking particularly about Yiquan instructors in the West. I mean, there's charlatans all over the world, including in China, but particularly instructors in the West. And I'm not even saying that they're charlatans, I'm saying that they reach a certain point and the training doesn't go into that level that what Han Huang and Zhao Daoxin talk about, like taking each one and being really serious about it as an actual investigator into how do you explore this system in terms of fight training, the context of fight training. I have multiple different definitions of each one, one of which is each one is fight training and practice based on quintessence principles of Chinese Wushu. So taking this idea and it being a project, an ongoing project, it's not a fixed thing that's passed down from the past, it can't be, as we'll talk about in a moment. Han Huang, Zhao Daoxin and others as well say, you know, like they give this picture of someone who's diligently researching this and thinking about how it works in the context of the fight and thinking about everything that's going on in the global fight scene. And what we see in each one, particularly those instructors outside of China, is it gets totally diverted away from this. I mean, I don't think there's anyone really who's doing that. If they are, they're certainly very, very low profile. Of those people who are like on social media, no one's really doing that. So what we find instead is a series of very predictable deviations from this path. So, for example, for me, the worst one is getting students where there is sparring, training, doing live training, getting students to do it, living through the students and then kind of relying on the reputation of students to somehow feed back into you. I hate that. But you never see the teacher themselves demonstrating anything in kind of live training. You know, it's each one. You should be able to do this well into your 50s, all being well. But they live through their students. And there's a limit to that because the teachers themselves they've not really been this thing where they've explored the realities of each one and how you might use it practically. They can't do that themselves. So as Wang Shengjai says, they can't teach it. They can't teach it. So this has a very limited lifespan in terms of teaching their students. That's very often, by the way, why you find that those students, where they are more serious, they will do more orthodox Sanda training or moving to something else. Then there's the people who just move into teaching other traditional martial arts and forms, and they make a living out of that. And then you've got the people who shift into kind of either spirituality, whatever they mean by that, or teaching Qigong, movements for health. And then you've got people who their classes are basically doing seminars where you work on very simple concepts around balance or basic training to move people around. And that's like the most, maybe you'll do some push hands or something like that, some light push hands, but mostly working on really simple ideas around moving people and off balancing people, that kind of thing. So correct me if I'm wrong, that's every Yiquan instructor in Western Europe. If there's one who isn't, let me know, right? Because they're certainly not, they haven't got any kind of profile on social media that I've been able to find. That's every single instructor in Yiquan outside of China, let's say, put it like that. Non-Chinese outside of China. They all fit into that category somewhere. None of them fit into this other category where you're actually seeing them able to do live training and bringing and discussing principles of each one beyond the theoretical level. And that's not just to criticise them. That's not just to be mean. It's a really important concept that Wang Shengjai tries to get across, that this then influences the the way that they think about the training. So it influences their explanations for things like zhan, their explanations for Shili, their explanations for each one as a whole. And they write this alternative assignment, and at the end of it, it's like somehow they're still, you know, they're going to get an A double star pass. You know, they're going to keep these titles, these meaningless titles that Wang Shengjai despised, like Master and Sifu, which is really what it's all about, isn't it? Like the meaningless stuff. Because they've passed the assignment that they've changed the question on. And the question really should have been, like Han Sihuang's already set this question for us, does your Yiquan training from top to bottom, from side to side, integrate into a training system that leads to practical fight outcomes? This is something here that interlinks, and you can see that this is Yiquan as a practical martial art. Not Yiquan as Yiquan as some kind of spiritual journey. That's absolutely fine to think about it like that, but it's got to be within the reality of the context of the fight. Fight training is the growth medium. So again, this narrative that people are writing, to keep themselves on track to get their first class pass, they manipulate the story, and they say things like, yeah, but I did loads of fighting back in the day, you know, when I did some other kind of martial art, or I've had street fights and, you know, I did all right, and, you know, this kind of thing. And they completely mislead the people, because it's the fight training itself that's the gel, the glue, the context, the growth medium that's got to be there all the time. As Yao Zhang says, it's the context in which everything else grows and is just. So if you want to talk about health outcomes, that's something that develops in the context of genuine overall focus on fight training. And if you're just going to do like standing in Yiquan for health, then you should just kind of say that. The problem is that all of these people also want to be seen in that category as practical experts of each one. And then they begin to manipulate how we think about the basic training. And this is kind of a two-edged thing, because the thing that they do most of all is emphasize the thing that they can do, which is basic training. So they overemphasize the importance of basic training. It never goes past that point. So all the seminars, all the lessons, all the classes, everything's about standing, everything's about trying to develop kind of, you know, elastic kind of forces as they understand it. Very simple things around push hands or unbalancing people, and then a massive focus on, you know, what does zhan do, and thinking about that, and all theories about zhan, and everything's focused on the stage prior to the actual fight application. The problem is, as Yao Zhang tells us, it's the actual fight application that's the context for this thing. So you can't just focus on all of this stuff and never get into this realm of Yiquan, and yet still know for sure that this is real, what you're talking about is real. It can't be. It can't be, because it's not in the context of this thing. It's not in the context of the reality of the fight. So let's think a little bit about how that happens practically in reality, how people conceptualize these ideas. First and most important thing, it's flagged up by Han Sihuang, and it's people who try and limit the idea of mind, intention, however you want to interpret it. I've said before, like it's the mark of a more sophisticated Yiquan practitioner that you understand that these simple words are very complex in reality. Wang Demo, Wang Shengjai's student, says we just use this idea of Yi as a shorthand for a range of very complex interconnected things that we want to explore. Thinking that Yi, first of all, is just one thing, and then very often, well, always, for the kind of people I'm talking about, it's always just captured at the training stage, the stage prior to where we start thinking about the reality of the fight. So, for example, saying that E means imagination. So just limiting it down to visualization in the training stage. I mean, just by definition, the idea of calling it imagination or evocative imagination, one person calls it, that by definition limits it to the training stage. Because when you're actually in a fight, other than the sophisticated stuff I'm talking about, like, you know, being able to, being able to visualize the centreline as a kind of virtual reality, that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about the use of visualization in training to stimulate effects in the body, and saying that that is E, and that's all it is. See, what's happening there is E is being just captured within the thing that person can do. They could never go past that into the practical reality fight stage. So they've captured their interpretation within the thing that they can do. And Han Huang flags this as a real mistake, that it's indicative of someone who doesn't understand the integration of the whole system. And he says specifically, those people who think that the E is just something about the training and preparatory stage, and not something that's flowers into something even more sophisticated when we start doing actual practical fight training, and indeed actual practical sparring, or indeed actually have a fight. Those people who don't understand that, they've not understood Yiquan at all. Instead, they've created their own essay, what is Yiquan, and one of the sections as they explain the Yiquan method is to talk about this idea that, well, Yi's just imagination, it's just the use of visualization. That confuses a training process, because we do use imagination, of course. Visualization is the use of imagination in one sense. It confuses the training process with, well, it obscures the outcome with the training process, and it confuses the two and thinks that the outcome is just the training process, in which case the outcome is just being able to hold a posture and visualize. So for them, they've achieved Yiquan. They've achieved Yiquan if they can do that, because they've redefined the training process as the outcome. So if they can do the training process, they can do the outcome. But where's the actual ability to use this in practical sense? Another variation on this is to focus on the idea of E as something that is doing something at the cellular level, which is quite interesting. Again, it's primarily focusing it on the training stage. So I think there's a few things we can say about this. I suppose before I even say that, we can say that like actually Wang Xiangjai didn't know really what Zhan Zhuang did from a purely scientific perspective, and there's a couple of reasons we know this. For one, like, he didn't have an electron microscope or something like that to look at how proteins function in muscle cells and things like that, and so you can see with Wang Xiangjai that he changes his mind a lot about what's going on with standing. He himself doesn't have the scientific capability or resources to, you know, obviously there is things going on when we're feeling sensations and things like that. Obviously there is something going on. Whatever it does and whatever claims we make for it, nevertheless something is happening. He doesn't have the scientific wherewithal to see exactly what's going on in Zhan Zhuang. But also, his senior students all say that, you know, after Wang Xiangjai passed away, really the understanding of Zhan Zhuang was very limited. It wasn't like, this tells us, for example, that this isn't some secret knowledge that was passed down, like Wang Xiangjai himself says, on a turtle shell, passed down from the ancients as a complete set knowledge system. So that really gives the lie to those branches of so-called Yiquan who say that, you know, it's this kind of Shaolin marrow washing secret technique that's been passed down and so on. We know that it wasn't. We know that it wasn't because we know that the study of Zhan Zhuang and the conceptualization of Zhan Zhuang was like almost non-existent when Wang Xiangjai died. People could do it and they could get effects from it, but understanding it and explaining it coherently, that was like an absolute minimal level. And several of Wang Xiangjai's students tell us that. The implication of that is that Wang Xiangjai himself didn't really understand. You know, he could do it, obviously, but his his understanding of it was bodily and experiential, which is what matters at the end of the day. But Wang Xiangjai himself told us this, that being unable to explain it scientifically means that you can't really pass it on. Someone else has got to go through the same process of kind of bodily experience, which is very important in each one. But if we want to explain it scientifically, scientifically, then he couldn't do that. He couldn't do that. So he couldn't pass on that kind of information, and we don't have it. But we've got some really interesting suppositions around this. So one is the idea that zhan nourishes the cells. And I find that quite an interesting, it's interesting on multiple different levels. Of course, first of all, it doesn't mean anything. It's a way of speaking that's escaped its context. So you can say that zhan nourishes the whole body, and that's like a kind of, just like a saying. It's not got a scientific basis, but it kind of jumps ship onto the science ship, because now it involves cells and nourishing cells. But when you break that down, what does that mean? Scientifically, what does that mean? When we get the electron microscope on the cells, what are we actually going to see in terms of cells being nourished? It's a little bit like those adverts for shampoo, where people use science-sounding words to say what this shampoo is going to do to your hair, but it's just a made-up scientific word. Nutrice, rub Nutrice onto your arms and the cells will become nourished. Doesn't actually mean anything whatsoever. It's a pseudo-scientific concept. Or if it isn't, no evidence whatsoever has been presented to say what this would mean. It's just something that somebody's decided, well, it must do that. You know, this must be what zhan does. A related idea that I suppose is a little bit more scientific is the idea that zhan activates cells in some way that makes them engage in a state where they are in that kind of perfect combination of relaxation and tension that we're looking for overall in zhan. That's a little bit more scientific, because we know certainly for certain kinds of muscle cells, like skeletal muscle, there's 3 different kinds of muscle. I'm going to go into the idea of muscle in a moment. Skeletal muscle does have this ability, obviously, like, because we can move. So there is obviously a connection between intent and the cell function that makes muscles move. And it is a cell function. In fact, it's even within the cells. It's the way the proteins work in the cells to make the muscles move. And if I can do that, and I can do it based on my intention, then there obviously is a connection between my intent and the proteins in my muscle cells. There obviously is. There's a link, whether we feel that directly or just through the movement itself. There's a link. So that's a little bit more scientific. But again, when we're talking about certain kinds of cells that do that, and it's not clear that the sensations that we feel when we're doing zhan, because as I'm going to talk about soon, some of the feelings that we get are through the whole body, and include parts of the body that aren't skeletal muscle cells. So not to get into this idea of fascia, but you know, fascia itself is a real thing, and it goes throughout the body, and that can feel, that's got cells. So it could be that, but also skin cells and bones and just feelings that are all over, in the eyes, everywhere. Well, there's muscles in the eyes. Feelings everywhere, all over the body and in different parts of the body, not just in skeletal muscle. So I'm going to say, yeah, maybe. Like, I'd suggest a more sophisticated idea that it's holding relaxation and tension at every level, from the gross through to the micro level. But again, that's not a scientific, to investigate that scientifically is incredibly difficult. Then we've got some other stuff that's just nonsense, where people think like you get some kind of magic power, but that's not even worth talking about. What is interesting then is to think like, well, what do we mean by scientific? So that's been a very misleading way of thinking. It's a product of its age, that as Wang Xianjia himself, he was moving from a kind of the ancient world way of thinking, moving into the modern way of thinking, and changing a lot of his ideas as he went along, very often reinterpreting concepts in new ways to be more in harmony with science. But the idea of science itself makes us think about kind of biology and like the ability to see things, to get microscopes on things, and to be able to measure and to have exact scientific style measurements of things that are going on in the body. Like you're going to put electrodes on something in your body, and you're going to measure impulses and things like that, which some people have done on some studies on visualisation. We'll talk about in a bit. But that's very different, for example, to the thing where, like, you know, someone throws a punch and you just do that and you move out of the way. Like, yeah, you can measure the scientific impulses, but there's something different going on. Let's say even more so, like this idea of courage that Wang Qianzhai really emphasises. So, and Yao Zhongzhun, well, all his students, I suppose, creating this sense that, you know, like, one of the things they wanted to get people to learn is how to overcome fear. So something like that, and the feeling, you know, the different feelings you have when you're sparring or when you're fighting, when you're in a real fight, those feelings, like, they're not just reducible to chemicals in the brain. There's something much more sophisticated going on in terms of that interlink with E. And consciousness and subconsciousness, if we want to use that word. And if we don't believe that in each one, then who does? You know, they're not just reducible. You know, like, you know, there's forever people saying that you can reduce things like love to a chemical or something like that. But things that are experiential exist as experiential things, even if they have other things that form them. So there are lots of things in zhan that we don't actually have to explain them in those specifically scientific terms. We don't have to put an electric meter on or something to measure how much electrical impulse is generated by a posture or something like that. We don't have to do that. To be in accordance with science, first of all, we don't want things that contradicts the laws of science, so all this magic power nonsense. And we can just then have things that we can rationally explain. And we don't have to explain everything. As long as we can get results, then we don't have to explain everything. We can accept that some things are a little bit more difficult to explain. Maybe there's going to be some scientific investigation, but all we need really is a rational explanation up to a certain point that leads into functional ability. So that brings the discussion back to these people who haven't made that transition over into functional ability. All of this stuff that they're talking about is all about keeping our focus on the training stage. Hours and hours of thinking about all different postures and, you know, people writing about elastic force and mind force, and where's the outcome? You know, where's the outcome of this? It's all about keeping the focus on the training and saying that this is each one, and there's no this bit where it's all about putting the gloves on and being able to do something in reality. And if you look at each one, people discussing like online and stuff like that, it's just endless discussion about this stuff, different postures and all kinds of things that people have begun to convince themselves of. Like even in Yao's each one, people thinking like, you know, there's someone was lecturing me that the slightest deviation from the officially set Yao's Yiquan standing postures, you know, like it's like some kind of really grave sin and it can cause massive damage to your body and negative and detrimental effects. And I can just go and show you the passage where Yao Zhongzhun is laughing at people who think like that. Yao Zhongzhun talks about people who fetishize a particular posture like it's going out of fashion. And he says, it doesn't matter at all, it's the intent behind the posture. Any human movement could be a zhuang. It's the intent behind the posture and what you're using the posture to train. So similarly, you've got people who are talking about things like mind force and the ability to use the integration of the mind with physical movement. Well, actually everyone does. Everyone who can move does that. In fact, everyone is alive because the mind force is keeping the organs going. It's doing something in the body. They're all like red herrings. They're all misleading us down this idea of like what's going on in the training. And because it's not contextualized by the reality of the fight, then it's not actually, it doesn't link because they've never made that step, so it doesn't link into that. And even this thing about, you know, multiple different postures for different things. Wang Demo very interestingly says, like, out of the second and third generation, many of the people who like actually really achieved real skill only used 2 or even 1 zhuang. And he says, like, you've got to think about that. Like, you've got like people who achieved, he says, you know, people that he knew who achieved a really good fight level for the time, just using one. Doesn't say which one, but just using one. And he says like, and that doesn't matter because it's the feeling that you're generating and creating in the posture is far more important than the posture itself. So that, I mean, that's another thing. Why I'm saying that is that's another thing that people focus on when they fetishize training. They focus and fetishize on the shape of postures and things like zhuangs and different zhuangs and how are your fingers exactly right. And I mean, there's things around that you can explain scientifically. Well, that comes into the idea of things being task specific that Yaozong's saying. They've got to be, think about the task that you're doing it for. But thinking like, you know, like if you do this, you know, should your hands be in more? Should they be out more? You know, can you put your head down like that? That's actually a legitimate one of the old school zhuangs. When you do this, you know, this kind of posture, you know, should it be like that? Should it be like that? Can you do that? And fetishizing them like there's some kind of, like they're sacred shapes that will create a magical force. And Yaozong says that's just absolute nonsense. It's nonsense. And this idea that Wang Demo's talking about, no, it can just be one. It can just be one movement. Mysterious zhuang. That's my favourite of all. Yao Zongzhen's favourite. Used to practice it in a mirror at night.